The letter was in her hand when he walked through the door. Maria Alden had not moved from the window seat in over an hour, and the paper she held had been folded and unfolded so many times across 6 years that the creases had gone soft as cloth, the ink bleeding faintly at the corners where her fingers had touched the words most often. She had read it again that morning, the same way she had read it on 100 other mornings, tracing the careful, unpracticed handwriting of a man who had told her, plainly and without ornament, that he was not a man of words, that he had only one thing worth saying, that he hoped she would not think less of him for saying it badly. She had carried that letter from Abilene to Tucson, from Tucson to the high desert ranch outside the town of Red Rock, Arizona Territory, in the year of 1883. She had carried it through a first marriage that had left her widowed and dry-eyed at a graveside in the summer heat. She had carried it through 2 hard winters and 1 extraordinary drought, through the slow rebuilding of her father's cattle operation and the quieter, longer rebuilding of herself. And now Edgar Barker was standing in the doorway of her father's ranch house, hat in his hands, dust on his boots, looking at her with an expression she had never been able to name, not even when she had tried to describe it to herself in the dark hours before sleep. She had answered the letter 3 weeks ago. She had written 12 drafts on salvaged paper by the light of a kerosene lamp. She had sealed the final version with wax and given it to the Red Rock postmaster with hands that did not entirely cooperate. And she had said nothing to anyone, because what she would have said was too large and too frightening to put into ordinary speech. He had ridden 400 miles. She could see that in him. The set of his shoulders said it. The exhaustion around his eyes said it. The fact that he had come at all after 6 years of silence from her side said everything else. Maria, he said, just her name, nothing attached to it. She looked at him across the room, the letter still in her hand, and felt the whole weight of 6 years pressed down into a single moment that she was not entirely sure she could survive standing up. "You got it," she said, not a question. She knew he had gotten it or he would not be here. "I got it," Edgar Barker said, and the silence that came after that was the most honest conversation she had ever had with any living person. 6 years earlier, in the summer of 1877, Maria Alden had been 22 years old and living in Abilene, Kansas, with her father, James Alden, who ran a livestock brokerage out of a narrow 2-story building on the main street. Abilene was not what it had been in the cattle drive years, when the Kisham Trail had poured longhorns and trail hands through it like water through a funnel, but it was still a working town with a working railroad, and enough commerce to keep a man like James Alden reasonably prosperous. He was not rich. He was careful, and careful men of that era tended to do all right as long as the weather held and the railroad rates did not shift too dramatically against them. Maria had grown up between her father's ledger books and her mother's garden, which was the most ambitious garden in Abilene and possibly in all of Dickinson County, with roses that her mother had brought from Ohio as root cuttings wrapped in damp burlap. Her mother, Clara Alden, had died of a fever in 1872, when Maria was 17, and the garden had gone on blooming without her, which had always struck Maria as both beautiful and faintly unjust. She had grown into a composed young woman with dark eyes, and a habit of watching a situation longer than most people were comfortable being watched. She read whatever she could acquire, which in Abilene in those years meant the Kansas newspapers, a small collection of inherited novels, and the catalogs that came with the railroad shipments, which she found unexpectedly informative about the wider world. She was considered by the women of Abilene to be serious, and by the men to be difficult, which were probably the same quality described from 2 different directions. Edgar Barker had come to Abilene in June of 1877, which was the beginning of things. He had come with a small remuda of horses he was selling on behalf of a rancher in the Texas Panhandle named Goodwell, who trusted Edgar to get a fair price and not to drink it afterward. Edgar was 26, lean and sun-darkened, with the particular economy of movement that comes from spending most of your formative years working outdoors at hard physical tasks. He was not what people called a talker. He had grown up on the Barker family homestead in the Panhandle, one of 4 brothers, the second youngest, in a household where James Barker Sr. spoke primarily in directives, and the rest of the family communicated mainly in action. You did things. You said enough to coordinate the doing. That was the system, and Edgar had never had reason to question it until he met Maria Alden in her father's brokerage and stood across a desk from her, while she reviewed the papers on Goodwell's horses with the kind of focused, thorough attention that made him feel, oddly, that everything he had ever done in his life was being quietly audited. He sold the horses in 2 days. He stayed in Abilene for 5. He could not afterward have told you exactly why. He had a return arrangement with a freighter going back south by way of Dodge City. He could have caught it on the 3rd day. He chose not to, and he spent the extra 2 days doing nothing in particular except finding reasons to be on the same side of town as the Alden brokerage, which was not a large town, so this was not a difficult geography to manage. On the 4th evening, he encountered Maria at the post office, where she was collecting a package of books her father had ordered from a St. Louis supplier. He helped her carry them. They walked 4 blocks together. She talked about the books, which were a mixture of agricultural reference texts and a novel she had particularly requested, and he listened in the specific way he had of making a person feel that they were the most interesting thing currently occurring in the world, which was not a performance on his part, but simply the way his attention worked. She said goodbye at the brokerage door. He walked back to the hotel where he was staying and sat on the edge of the bed in the gathering dark, and felt the particular hollow feeling of someone who has just understood that they are about to miss something important and cannot figure out how to prevent it. He was not a man who could have said any of this out loud. He was not built for it. He had tried once, at 19, to tell a girl in Amarillo that he thought about her, and the words had come out so wrong and sideways that she had laughed, not unkindly, but with the genuine amusement of someone who has just heard something absurd. He had learned from that experience to keep his thoughts in place. But he had never in his life sat down and written a letter, and he did it now, at the small desk in the hotel room by the light of the lamp. On paper he had to ask the hotel clerk to sell him, with a pen that had seen better days and ink that was slightly too pale. He wrote slowly, crossing out lines, starting again, going through 4 false starts on 4 separate sheets before he had something that said, in the plainest language he had, what he meant. He did not say that he was in love with her. He was not sure that was a word he had the right to use for something that was only 5 days old. He said that he had met a great many people in his life, and that meeting her had been different from meeting any of them. He said that he thought she was remarkable, and that he was aware that was an inadequate word for what he meant. He said that he did not live in Abilene and did not know when he would pass through again, but that if she ever wanted to correspond, he would answer every letter she sent, and he gave her the address of the Goodwell Ranch in the Panhandle, which was the most permanent address he had. He said that he had never written a letter before, and that he hoped it did not show too much, though he suspected it did. He folded it and took it to the post office before he could change his mind, and then he caught the freight wagon south the following morning and did not look back at Abilene as it receded behind him, because he was not a man who made a habit of looking backward. Maria received the letter 4 days later. She read it standing at the hall table where the family's mail was sorted, which she later thought was possibly the wrong place to read it, because it was too exposed and her father might have come downstairs at any moment and found her standing with her mouth slightly open, reading a letter from a Texas horse trader she had met for 40 minutes total over 2 encounters. She read it 3 times before she put it down. She picked it up and read it a 4th time. She sat down in the hall chair with it in her hands, and stayed there long enough that the afternoon light had shifted perceptibly by the time she stood up again. She wanted to answer it immediately. She did not. She told herself she was being thoughtful, which was true. She told herself she needed to know what she wanted to say, which was also true. She told herself there was no urgency, which was where she began to mislead herself, because she felt urgency with a specificity that she recognized even then as significant and chose to manage rather than respond to. She did not answer the letter in July. She did not answer it in August. She told herself in September that she would answer it soon. And by October the word soon had become part of a private joke with herself that was not entirely funny. She put the letter in the small cedar box where she kept the things that mattered most to her, alongside a lock of her mother's hair and a photograph of her family from 1870, and she kept it there while the seasons changed around her. She did not answer it because she was afraid, not of Edgar Barker specifically, but of what answering meant. An answered letter was a begun thing. A begun thing could become anything at all, and she had spent 5 years since her mother's death making everything in her life as manageable and contained as possible, because unmanageable and uncontained things hurt badly when they ended. She knew this the way you know anything that you have learned from inside the experience rather than from a book. In the spring of 1878, her father decided to relocate his livestock brokerage to the Arizona Territory, where land prices were lower and opportunity, he believed, was higher. He had been watching the southern cattle markets and the expanding rail connections with the attention of a man who understood that the Kansas cattle era was beginning its long decline and that the smart money was already moving. Maria packed her mother's roses as root cuttings, wrapped in damp burlap, just as her mother had once packed them for the journey from Ohio. She packed the cedar box. She packed the letter. Redrock, Arizona Territory, in 1878 was a raw town. It had a main street with 3 functional blocks of buildings, a rail depot that had been finished the previous year, a saloon that was the most architecturally ambitious structure in town, a general store, a bank that had been robbed twice and was consequently very serious about its vault, and a scattering of residential buildings that gave the impression of a community that was still deciding exactly where it wanted to be. The desert around it was spectacular and indifferent, all red stone and sage and enormous sky, and Maria stood in front of the house her father had rented for their first year and felt the scale of it press against her in a way that Abilene, with its familiar streets and its tolerable smallness, never had. She planted the roses along the south wall of the house, where the afternoon shadow would keep them from burning in the worst of the summer heat. They took root. They bloomed the following spring, which she took as evidence that certain things could be transported across great distances and still become themselves. In 1879, her father introduced her to Thomas Reeves, who was a land attorney with an office in Redrock and ambitions that extended to cattle ownership, mining speculation, and territorial politics, approximately in that order of urgency. He was 34 to her 24, dark-haired and well-dressed, with a confident manner that Maria recognized as the performance of a man who had decided what kind of person he was going to be and was executing that decision with discipline. He was not unkind. He was not dishonest, at least not in any way she could prove. He wanted things, and one of the things he wanted was to be married to James Alden's daughter, because James Alden's livestock connections would complement his own operations very neatly. Maria knew this. She was not naive. She also knew that she was 24, that Redrock was not overflowing with suitable partners, that her father was aging and would benefit from a son-in-law with legal expertise, and that she had spent 6 years declining to answer a letter from a horse trader in the Texas Panhandle. She had made her choices. She lived inside them. She married Thomas Reeves in October of 1879. It was a small ceremony at the Redrock Church, attended by 40 people, with flowers from her mother's roses and a dress she had made herself from white lawn fabric ordered from the Tucson supplier. Her father cried. Thomas Reeves was attentive and pleasant throughout the day. She was composed. The marriage was not unhappy in any dramatic way. It was quiet and functional, which is its own kind of unhappiness but not the kind that announces itself. Thomas was occupied with his work, which expanded steadily in the early territorial years as land disputes and cattle grazing rights created a reliable supply of legal business. Maria ran the house with competent efficiency, managed the social obligations that came with being the wife of an increasingly prominent man, and continued to read everything she could acquire, which was now somewhat more than what had been available in Abilene. She kept the cedar box in the bottom of her wardrobe, under extra blankets. She never took the letter out when Thomas was in the house. She was not sure what this told her about the state of her marriage, and she did not investigate the question. Thomas Reeves died in the spring of 1881, which was neither dramatic nor deserved, but simply the brutal indifference of a fever that went to his lungs and did not leave. He was 36 years old. He had been sick for 11 days. The local doctor, who had trained in Philadelphia and had come west for reasons he never fully explained, did what he could, which was not enough. Maria sat with Thomas through the last nights, holding his hand and keeping cold cloths on his forehead, and when he died at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, she felt grief that was genuine and sadness that was real, mixed with a complicated undercurrent of something she would not name for another 2 years. She was 26 years old and a widow in the Arizona Territory in 1881, which was not a position without its complications. There were immediate practical questions about the legal practice, about the estate, about her father's property arrangements. Thomas had left his affairs in reasonable order, which was the most competent thing he had done for her. She inherited enough to be independent without being wealthy. She sold the legal practice to a colleague of Thomas's from Tucson. She moved back into her father's house, which by now he owned outright, a solid adobe and timber structure on the north edge of town with a good well and the best established rose garden in the territory. That first year of widowhood, she found herself thinking about the letter more than she had in the whole of her marriage. She took it out of the cedar box and read it again in November of 1881, sitting by the lamp while the desert wind made sounds against the shuttered windows. The paper was more fragile than it had been. The ink had faded in places. The handwriting was still what it had been, careful and unpracticed, the writing of a man who was using a skill he did not trust. She knew, from what little her father's business contacts could tell her, that Edgar Barker was still working in the Texas-New Mexico cattle region, still associated with ranching operations, unmarried as far as anyone in the loosely connected world of Western livestock knew. She put the letter back in the box. She did not answer it. She was not ready yet, and she had enough self-knowledge by now to understand that rushing readiness was how you made the same kind of mistakes twice. She spent 1882 rebuilding herself more deliberately than she had rebuilt after her mother's death. She had been 17 then, with no model for grief except endurance. She was 27 now, and she chose something more constructive. She began helping her father with his brokerage in earnest, learning the business from the inside rather than from the margins where she had always stood before. She was good at it. She had a natural feel for the logic of livestock markets, for the relationship between grass conditions and cattle weight and rail shipping costs, and James Alden, who had not previously considered that his daughter might be interested in carrying on his work, began to understand that he had a potential partner in her. She also, in the early spring of 1883, began to write the letter. She did not write it all at once. She wrote pieces of it over several weeks, setting it aside when it felt too much and returning to it when she felt steadier. She told Edgar Barker that she owed him an explanation for the 6 years of silence, and she gave him one as honestly as she could. She told him about her fear, and about Thomas, and about the way she had used the letter as a touchstone through all of it, returning to it in the way that you return to something that holds a question you have not yet been brave enough to answer. She told him that she did not know if he was still in the same territory, or still unattached, or still remotely interested in a woman who had taken 6 years to find her courage. She told him that she would understand completely if there was no answer from him at all. She told him, finally, that she had thought about him far too much for someone she had known for less than a week, and that she suspected this was not a coincidence, but rather the particular kind of information that you only receive clearly in retrospect, when you have enough distance to see what was actually happening. She sealed the letter on a Tuesday evening in early April of 1883. She took it to the post office on Wednesday morning. She gave it to the postmaster and walked back through the spring morning feeling as though she had just put down something very heavy that she had been carrying for a very long time, and also as though she might not breathe properly again until she knew what happened next. What happened next was that Edgar Barker received the letter 12 days later at a ranch outside of Silver City, New Mexico Territory, where he had been working for the past 18 months as a cattle foreman for a ranching family named Caulfield. He had not been the same person at 32 that he had been at 26. The intervening years had done what years tend to do, which is to clarify certain things and complicate others. The horse trading work had given way gradually to ranch management, which suited him better because it was less transient and because he was good at it. He understood cattle and grass and water and weather in the bone-deep way that comes from growing up with all of them. The Caulfields trusted him, which was a condition he valued above most others. He had not married. He had been close to it once in 1879 with a woman named Agnes Harlow in Las Cruces, but she had ultimately decided that a man whose work kept him at a distant ranch rather than in town was not the life she wanted, and she had married a hardware merchant instead. Edgar had understood her reasoning completely and bore her no ill will. He had gone back to work and not thought about it very much. He had thought about Maria Alden, though, not constantly. Not in the way of a man consumed by an obsession. But she was there, the way certain things are there in the back of your mind, the way you carry the memory of a particular landscape, or a piece of music heard once that you cannot quite reconstruct but cannot quite forget. He had written that letter in 1877 with the certainty that it was a mistake and the inability to stop himself anyway, and he had not heard back, and he had eventually accepted that he was not going to, and he had kept living his life. When the letter came, addressed in a handwriting he did not recognize because he had never seen her write before, he was at the ranch house breakfast table with the Caulfield foreman's copy of the Silver City paper. He saw the Red Rock, Arizona Territory return address. He did not open it at the table. He took it outside into the morning light and stood by the corral fence and opened it. He read it once through quickly. He went back to the beginning and read it again, slowly. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket over his heart, which was a thing he did without thinking about it, and he stood by the fence for a long time looking at the mountains to the north of the Caulfield property. He had $340 in savings in the Silver City Bank. He had a horse that was his own, a good blue roan gelding named Cass. He had no property and no permanent attachments. He was 32 years old. He went inside and told the Caulfield family that he would be leaving within the week, that he was sorry for the short notice, that he would help find and train a replacement foreman before he went, and that working for them had been the best foreman work he had ever done. He said the last thing because it was true and because he believed in finishing things cleanly. He spent 4 days helping organize his replacement. He drew his pay on Friday. He left Saturday morning, before the heat of the day, riding southeast toward the Arizona Territory with Cass in good condition beneath him and everything he owned in his saddlebags. He rode through country that was spectacular and difficult, through the dry hills of southern New Mexico and into the Arizona Territory by a route that took him through the San Simon Valley, and then west and north toward Red Rock. It was 400 miles by the route he rode, which was not the shortest possible path, but was the one that he knew best in terms of water sources, and a man alone in the desert in late April needed to know where the water was. He rode 4 days and camped on the trail at night, making fires with mesquite wood and cooking simple food and sleeping under enormous skies that were, at this latitude, so full of stars that they seemed implausible. He was not a man who talked to himself, but he found himself composing in his head what he was going to say when he arrived. He never arrived at a satisfactory version. Eventually, he stopped trying and trusted that something would occur to him in the moment, which was how he had always managed the things that mattered most. He reached Redrock on a Thursday afternoon in early May of 1883, rode down the main street past the bank and the general store and the saloon, asked at the post office for the location of the Alden property, and rode out to the north end of town with the afternoon sun tilting toward the mountains. The house was larger than he had imagined. It was a solid adobe structure with a covered porch along the front, and along the south wall grew the most extraordinary roses he had ever seen in the desert, a cascading mass of them in deep pink and cream, blooming in full riot against the red earth wall, and he stopped Cass for a moment just to look at them, because they were the most domestically improbable thing he had encountered in years of riding through the territory. He tied Cass at the hitching post. He took his hat off. He walked to the door and knocked. There was a pause, then footsteps. Then the door opened, and Maria Alden was looking at him, and behind her in the room he could see the afternoon light through a west-facing window, and she was holding a piece of paper that he recognized even at a distance as a letter that had been folded and unfolded a great many times. She said, "You got it." He said, "I got it." And they stood there in the held silence of 6 years of questions about to become answers. "Come in," she said finally, and stepped back from the door. He came in. She moved to the parlor, where there were 2 chairs facing each other across a small table, and he followed her, turning his hat slowly in his hands. He was aware of the smallness of the room relative to the size of what was happening in it. "My father is at the brokerage," she said. "He will be back by supper." She looked at him with the direct attention he remembered. "You rode 400 miles. Give or take," he said. "Why didn't you write back first?" He thought about that. "I was afraid that if I wrote back you would write back and we would spend another 6 years writing letters at each other." Something changed in her face. Not quite a smile yet, but the direction toward one. "That's a reasonable fear," she said. "I'm not much for letters," he said. "You probably noticed, given that I wrote exactly one in my life." "I did notice that," she said. "I noticed that for 6 years." He looked at the letter in her hands. "Can I ask something?" "Yes." "Did you read it often?" The something in her face became, unmistakably, a smile, though it was the complicated kind, the kind that holds several feelings at once. "Often enough that the paper is nearly worn through," she said. He absorbed this. "And you didn't write back because you were afraid," he said. Not an accusation. Just the fact of it as she had given it to him in her letter. "Yes." "Of what exactly, if you don't mind me asking?" She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light shifted. Outside somewhere, a bird was making a sound in the heat. "Of beginning something," she said. "Of wanting something I couldn't see clearly enough to trust." He nodded slowly. "And now? Now I've had 6 years to see it more clearly," she said. "And I've had a husband I was composed with and a widowhood I was composed with and 2 years of rebuilding myself. And I'm 28 years old in the Arizona territory, and the thing I am most certain of right now is that I should have written that letter in 1877, and I am sorry that I didn't." He sat with that. "I'm not sure you should be sorry," he said. "You were 22 and I was a stranger who rode in to sell horses and stayed 5 days. You wrote me a letter." "I wrote you a letter," he agreed. "Which I was not previously capable of. You said as much in it. Did you think less of me for it? The way it was written," she shook her head, and the directness of her response was itself a kind of eloquence. "It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me," she said. "That's why I kept it." Edgar Barker looked at Maria Alden across the small table in the late afternoon parlor, with the desert light coming through the window and the roses blooming impossibly outside, and felt the particular sensation of a man who has ridden 400 miles and arrived somewhere that was worth every single one of them. "I should tell you some things about my situation," he said, "so that you have the full picture." "All right," she said. "I have $340 saved. I have a horse. I have no property and no current employment, having left the Caulfield Ranch 4 days ago. I know cattle management well, and I have a reasonable reputation in that line of work in New Mexico and the Texas Panhandle. I'm 32 years old." "I know," she said. "You know my age." "My father's brokerage corresponds with a number of ranching operations in New Mexico and Texas," she said, with the faintest edge of something that might have been mischief. "The Goodwell Ranch is among them. I may have asked, some months ago, how their former horse trader was getting on." He stared at her. "You checked on me." "I did, before you wrote the letter. A woman in my position cannot be entirely incautious," she said, and the mischief was now definite. "You might have become a completely different person in 6 years. And had I? According to the Goodwell correspondence, you had become somewhat more responsible and less inclined to take unnecessary risks with other men's horses," she said, "which I considered a positive development." He laughed. It was not a sound he produced frequently, and it surprised him slightly when it came out. "You investigated me through livestock correspondence. I used available resources." "Maria Alden," he said, and the saying of her full name was something that felt in his mouth like it had been waiting there a long time for permission to come out. "I rode 400 miles. I know. What do we do now?" She folded the letter once more with the careful habit of long practice and set it on the table between them. "Now," she said, "you stay for supper and meet my father properly, and we talk, and after that we see." James Alden came home from the brokerage at 6 in the evening and stopped in the doorway of his own parlor with the particular expression of a father who had come home to find an unexpected man in his front room. He was 61, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of a man who had spent 30 years in the livestock trade across 2 territories. He looked at Edgar with the professional assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating things on first sight. "Papa," Maria said, in a tone that Edgar recognized as the voice of a woman who had prepared for this moment in advance and was now executing her preparation with discipline. "This is Edgar Barker. He worked as a foreman at the Caulfield Ranch in Silver City, and before that in the Texas Panhandle. He came to Abilene in 1877 to sell horses for the Goodwell operation." James Alden's eyes moved between his daughter and the stranger in his parlor with a comprehension that was either very quick or had been working toward this conclusion for some time. He looked at Edgar. "Barker," he said, "you're the horse trader." "I was," Edgar said. "More recently I have been in cattle management." "You rode out here from Silver City." "Yes, sir." "And you wrote my daughter a letter," James Alden said, "6 years ago." There was a pause. Edgar did not flinch from it. "I did." James looked at Maria. Some signal passed between them that Edgar could not quite read. Then James extended his hand, and Edgar shook it, and whatever the signal had been, it seemed to have come down in his favor. Supper that evening was a meal that Edgar would remember for the rest of his life, not because of what was served, which was simple and good, beef and beans and cornbread and coffee, but because of the quality of conversation that happened over it. James Alden was not the kind of man to let social occasion override practical interest, and he asked Edgar pointed questions about cattle management, grazing rotations, water sourcing in dry terrain, and the economics of small herd versus large operation ranching, all of which Edgar answered with the specificity of someone who had spent 6 years doing this work and thinking carefully about it. Maria sat across the table and listened, and occasionally asked a question of her own that was, Edgar noticed, sharper than her father's and aimed at a different kind of information. She was not asking about cattle operations. She was asking about judgment, about what he did when things went wrong, about the Caulfield situation and the circumstances of his departure, and whether he had left other work before that. She was building a picture, efficiently and without apology, and he answered honestly because dishonesty in this context seemed both tactically foolish and morally wrong. After supper, James Alden excused himself to his study, with a discretion that Edgar suspected was deliberate, and Edgar and Maria sat on the porch in the cooling evening air with their coffee cups, while the desert settled into the particular silence of the post-sunset hour, when the heat begins to release from the earth, and the sky turns colors that no painter has ever quite managed. "Your father is a thorough man," Edgar said. "He is," she agreed. "He approves of thorough. What about you?" She looked out at the rose garden, which was lavender and gray in the fading light. "I am also thorough," she said, "as you may have noticed. I noticed you checked my references through cattle correspondence. I notice you don't seem to mind." He considered this. "No," he said, "I find I don't. It means you took it seriously." She looked at him sideways. "I took it seriously the first time I read it," she said. "In 1877, that was rather the problem." The evening deepened around them. Somewhere out in the desert, a coyote made a sound that started as a cry and became something between complaint and song. The stars came out in the particular abundance of high desert skies. "I would like to stay in Redrock for a while," Edgar said, "if that is all right, to give us time to know each other properly. I am aware that we have not had much of that." "We have had 6 years of a letter," she said. "That is not quite the same thing." "No," she agreed, "but it is not nothing either." He stayed. He took a room at the Redrock Hotel, a room with a view of the main street that cost him 30 cents a night, and he spent his first week in town familiarizing himself with its workings and its people with the unhurried attention that was his natural mode of operating. Redrock in the spring of 1883 was a town that was growing, if not explosively, at least with conviction. The cattle ranching in the surrounding valleys was expanding as more families moved into the territory, and the railroad connection made it possible to ship cattle to Tucson and beyond without the long overland drives that had characterized the earlier era. He called on Maria at the ranch house every morning, which was a sufficiently regular interval that Redrock's attentive social community was aware of the situation within 3 days. He helped with the rose garden, at her direction, because the roses needed attention in the spring, and he had capable hands and no pride about what work those hands did. He attended Sunday church with the Aldens, sitting beside James in the pew while Maria sat on James's other side, which was technically appropriate and practically transparent. In the evenings, they talked. This was where things happened most significantly, in the long conversations on the porch or in the parlor while James Alden sat in his study doing his accounts, within hearing distance but not interfering. They talked about everything, the kind of everything that happens between people who have a backlog of 6 years of questions and the sudden freedom to ask them. He told her about his family in the Panhandle, his 3 brothers, his father's particular form of silence and his mother's compensating warmth. He told her about the girl in Amarillo at 19 and the words that had come out wrong, and she laughed, not unkindly, and told him that the letter he had written at 26 had done considerably better, whatever its imperfections. He told her about Agnes Harlow in Las Cruces and the hardware merchant and the lack of bitterness he felt about it, and she listened with the attention she gave everything, and said that she understood Agnes's reasoning even if she was perhaps not entirely sympathetic to the execution. She told him about Thomas Reeves, which was something she had not told anyone with complete honesty. She told him about the functional quiet of that marriage and the complicated grief of losing it, and about the undercurrent she had not named for 2 years, which was guilt, because she had never been entirely present in that marriage in the way a woman ought to be present, because some part of her had been elsewhere, in a cedar box at the bottom of a wardrobe. He listened without judgment and said when she had finished that she had nothing to be guilty for. That people did the best they could with the information and courage available to them at any given moment. That is a generous interpretation, she said. It is the accurate interpretation, he said. There is a difference. She looked at him with the directness he had grown in 2 weeks, completely accustomed to and specifically dependent on. "You are a kinder person than you present yourself to be," she said. "I don't present myself any particular way," he said. "That is exactly what I mean," she said. 3 weeks into his stay in Red Rock, the local cattle situation provided Edgar with an unexpected opportunity. A rancher named Hollies, who ran a mid-sized operation in the valley southwest of town, had lost his foreman to a competing ranching family and was in urgent need of someone competent to manage his spring roundup and branding operation. James Alden, who knew everyone in the regional cattle business and had heard Edgar's qualifications firsthand over several dinners, mentioned to Hollies that there was a man currently in town with the right experience. Hollies came to the hotel and made Edgar an offer, which Edgar accepted after asking 3 specific questions about the operation's current condition and receiving answers that satisfied him. He rode out to the Hollies ranch on a Monday morning with his saddlebags and casts in good form and began work that same day. He came back to Red Rock on weekends, which were his only full days off, and continued calling on Maria, who had by now dropped the formal distance of their first 2 weeks and allowed a warmth into their interactions that made everything feel more like what it was becoming and less like what it had started as. On the 3rd weekend of his Hollies employment, she showed him the cedar box. They were sitting in the parlor after dinner, James having retired early with what he described as a headache, but which Edgar privately thought might be strategic, and she got up and went to her room and came back with the box in her hands. She set it on the table between them, the same table where she had set the letter on his first evening in Red Rock, and she opened it. The lock of hair, dark and fine, wrapped in a small piece of cloth. The photograph, its image slightly faded but the family group still legible. And his letter, more fragile than it had been in 1877, the creases soft as cloth. He picked it up with more care than he usually gave to objects. He unfolded it and read it, which was an unusual experience, reading something you had written 6 years ago in a state of emotional urgency that you had subsequently spent some effort not thinking about. The words were worse than he remembered. The handwriting was effortful and uneven, but the meaning was clear, and the person who had written it had meant it completely, and he felt a current of recognition toward that younger self that was more compassionate than he usually managed when looking backward. "I was not a gifted writer," he said. "No," she agreed, "but you were a completely honest one. That was all it was. That was everything," she said. He folded the letter with the same care she had always given it back into its familiar shape and set it in the box. He looked at her. "Maria," he said, "yes, I would like to court you properly, with your father's knowledge and agreement. I want to be clear about what I am doing here." She held his gaze. "I believe it is already fairly clear to my father," she said. "He is not a slow man. Nevertheless." "Then speak to him," she said. "He will tell you what he thinks." He spoke to James Alden the following morning before riding back to the Hollies ranch, catching the older man on the porch with his coffee in the early morning cool. He said, without decoration, that he had come to Red Rock with serious intentions toward Maria, that he was currently employed and building toward a more permanent situation, that he understood he had no property and limited savings, but that he was a capable man with good prospects and a serious character, and that he would like James's blessing to court her formally. James Alden drank his coffee and looked at the rose garden for a long enough moment that Edgar considered the possibility that the answer was going to be no. "She kept your letter for 6 years, James said, finally. "She told me." "She did not tell me at the time," James said. "She told me last week when it became clear that you were not just passing through. I had known something was in that cedar box that she took everywhere, but she did not say what it was." He looked at Edgar. "A woman does not carry a letter for 6 years unless it matters." "No, sir," Edgar said. "You left a good position to ride 400 miles. "Yes, sir. A man does not do that unless the thing on the other end matters." "No, sir." James was quiet again. The morning brightened incrementally. The roses were orange gold in the early light. "She has been through a hard few years," James said. not dramatically, but in the quiet way that is sometimes harder, because there is nothing specific to push against. He looked at Edgar with the steady, measuring look of a man who had spent his working life assessing value. She needs someone whose presence is as reliable as his character, not someone who will be good for a year and then find the work too far from town, or the winters too long, or the territory not quite what he wanted. "I understand," Edgar said. "Do you?" "I have been working in this territory and the surrounding ones for 6 years," Edgar said. "I left the Caulfield Ranch because Maria Alden wrote me a letter, and I have been looking for an excuse for years, and I was not about to let this one pass. I am not a man who needs to be anywhere particular. I need work I am good at and people I trust, and if I am honest, I need that woman sitting in there to be somewhere I can see her with some regularity. I have known that since 1877, and I am done pretending otherwise." James Alden set his coffee cup down on the porch railing and looked at Edgar with something that was not quite a smile, but was the particular expression of a man who has heard exactly what he wanted to hear. "Court her properly," he said. "Do not make her wait any longer than she has already waited." "I don't intend to," Edgar said. The courtship that followed was proper and earnest and genuinely beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are happening at exactly the right time and with exactly the right person. Edgar came to the Alden house every Saturday evening and spent Sunday with the family, attending church and Sunday dinner, and the long afternoon hours on the porch. During the week, he sent notes by the Raydrock post when he had things to say that could not wait until Saturday, which was a kind of letter writing he had not been capable of before but found, with Maria as the recipient, came somewhat easier than he would have predicted. She wrote back to every note. Her writing was exactly what he would have expected from her, clear and specific, with a dry humor tucked into corners that made him smile in the bunkhouse, in a way that the Holly's ranch hands found noteworthy. He proposed to her in September of 1883, 5 months after he had ridden into Raydrock, on a September evening when the desert had finally released the summer heat, and the air had the particular crystalline quality that comes to high desert elevations in the fall. They were walking the edge of her father's property, along the path between the house and the wash to the north, and the moon was up and nearly full, and he stopped walking and turned to her and said, with the same plain directness he brought to everything, that he wanted to marry her, and that he was asking without a ring because he wanted her to choose the ring herself, which was a detail he had thought about and felt strongly about. She looked at him in the moonlight for a long moment, and in her face he could see the ending of a long waiting and the beginning of a long everything else, and she said yes in a voice that was steadier than she felt and completely certain of itself. "Yes." He said, "Yes," she said, "though you should know that I have been certain of this since approximately the 3rd Saturday you came to supper. Why didn't you say so? A woman likes to be asked," she said, with the mischief that he had come to treasure specifically. He laughed, the genuine laugh that still occasionally surprised him with its existence, and then he took her hands in his and stood with her in the moonlit desert while the night spread its enormous silence around them, and kissed her for the first time, carefully and with great attention, the way he did everything that mattered most to him. They were married in November of 1883, a Saturday wedding at the Raydrock Church, which was fuller than anyone had quite expected because the town had taken an interest in the story, as small western towns tend to do with love stories that have been proceeding visibly on their main street for several months. Maria wore a dress of ivory wool, practical for the November weather, and beautiful in the way of things that are both functional and carefully made. Her mother's roses were not blooming in November, but she carried a spray of dried ones from the summer, carefully preserved, with their color still holding. Edgar stood at the front of the church with the church's minister, and the best man's role filled by Robert Hollis, his employer's younger brother, who had become something like a friend over the months at the ranch. James Alden walked Maria down the aisle with an expression of contained joy that Edgar recognized in that moment, as the particular pride of a father who has seen his daughter find something genuinely worthy of her. The vows were the traditional ones. Edgar said them in the flat, honest voice he used for important things, looking at her face throughout, and not once at the minister or the congregation. And she said hers with the same deliberate directness she brought to everything. And the minister announced them married. And the church produced the kind of sound that small churches produce when they contain people who are genuinely pleased by what they have just witnessed. The reception was held at the Alden house, where James had organized a supper for 40 people, which required the parlor and the front room and the porch and somewhat strained the capacity of the rose garden, though the rose garden bore it beautifully. There was fiddle music and dancing in the cleared space on the south side of the house, and Edgar danced with Maria in the firelight with the concentrated effort of a man who had learned the waltz specifically for this occasion, which was apparent in his execution, but more than compensated for by his conviction. "You practiced," she said, when they had made it through most of the first dance without catastrophe. "I paid Robert Hollies' wife 2 Saturday afternoons to teach me," he said. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever done," she said. "I can think of something more romantic," he said. "What is that?" "Riding 400 miles," he said. She put her forehead briefly against his shoulder, which was not entirely conventional for the public dance floor of a Western wedding reception, but the people of Redrock who witnessed it found they did not mind at all. James Alden, watching from the porch with his glass of whiskey, looked at his daughter in the firelight and felt something settle in him that had been unresolved for a long time. The early months of marriage were full and good in a way Edgar had not specifically anticipated, not because he had expected marriage to be anything other than good, but because the specific quality of goodness was different from what his imagination had produced. He had imagined, vaguely, a more separate arrangement, 2 people living in proximity and managing their individual lives with occasional overlap. What he found instead was something more integrated, a gradual interweaving of habits and rhythms and ways of seeing things that changed the texture of daily existence entirely. They lived in the Alden house for the first year, which was both practical and, Edgar came to understand, James Alden's way of giving his daughter the transition time she needed. James himself was aging in ways that were beginning to show in his energy and his eyesight, and having Edgar in the household gave the older man a kind of daily anchor that he had not had since his wife's death over a decade earlier. Edgar liked James. He liked his methodical intelligence and his dry commentary on the state of the cattle markets, and his habit of reading the Tucson paper aloud at the breakfast table with editorial annotations. Edgar continued his work with the Hollies Ranch through the first winter, and in the spring of 1884, when his position with Hollies had given him enough standing in the regional ranching community, he and Maria had a serious conversation about their future that was one of the best conversations Edgar had ever participated in. She had been, over the winter, building something with her father's brokerage that was more than assistance. She had a genuine talent for the work, which was becoming clear to James and to the surrounding ranching operations, who found that dealing with Maria Alden Barker was efficient and reliable in ways that made their operations smoother. She had ideas about expanding the brokerage into a more formal cattle commission operation, which would mean representing ranchers in negotiations with the railroad and the larger buyers, rather than simply brokering individual animal sales. Edgar listened to this proposal with complete attention, and then said that he thought it was exactly right, and that he would like to support it however he could. "You don't want to build your own ranch operation?" she asked. She had expected this to be more complicated. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "The specific shape of the operation is something we should decide together based on what makes sense, not based on what I assumed I would be doing before I knew you." She looked at him across the breakfast table in the morning light. "You continually surprise me," she said. "Is that a problem?" "It is the opposite of a problem," she said. They spent the spring of 1884 developing the plan together. Edgar's knowledge of ranching operations gave Maria's commission brokerage idea a practical credibility it would not have had from a purely business background, and Maria's commercial intelligence gave the operation a structure and a financial logic that Edgar alone would not have arrived at. They went to James Alden with the plan, and James, who was perhaps already considering the question of retirement and the question of legacy, listened carefully and then said that he would like to be a partner in it if they would have him, which they would. The Alden Barker Cattle Commission was formalized in June of 1884. It was not an enormous enterprise. It had 3 people, a set of established relationships with the regional ranching community, a contract with the Southern Pacific Railroad for shipping coordination, and a shared understanding between its principals that made meetings both efficient and, frequently, entertaining. James Alden died in the winter of 1885, which was not unexpected, but was still the kind of loss that reshapes everything around it. He had been declining through the fall, his heart weakening in the gradual way of elderly hearts, and he died in his own bed on a January morning with Maria holding one hand and Edgar holding the other, which was where he wanted to be and how he wanted to go, with the 2 people he loved most present, and the rose garden outside, and the desert quiet around the house. Maria grieved deeply and without pretense. Edgar gave her the space to do that without trying to fix it or accelerate it, which was one of the things she valued most about him. His understanding that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a process to be accompanied. He kept the commission operation running during the months when she needed to step back, and when she was ready to return fully, she found everything in order and several new client relationships he had developed in her absence. They buried James beside his wife, Clara, in the Red Rock Cemetery on the east edge of town, under a headstone of red sandstone that Edgar had ordered from a stone carver in Tucson. Maria planted a rose cutting from her mother's garden on the grave, wrapped in damp burlap the way her grandmother had packed them for Ohio, the way her mother had packed them for Kansas, the way she herself had carried them to Arizona Territory. The rose took root the following spring and bloomed red. In the fall of 1885, Maria told Edgar she was expecting their first child. He was in the kitchen when she told him, eating his breakfast, and the news had the effect of making him put down his fork and sit entirely still for a moment in a way that she found, observing it, deeply endearing. "Edgar," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was slightly different than its usual register. "Are you all right?" He looked up at her with an expression that she had not seen before, something entirely open and without any of the careful management he usually applied to his strongest feelings. "I am more than all right," he said. "I am trying to find a word for it." "Take your time," she said. He thought about it. "Grateful," he said finally. "I am grateful in a way I don't have a better word for." The baby was born in June of 1886, a boy, delivered at the house by the Red Rock doctor, who by that time had been practicing in the territory long enough to be good at it. Edgar stayed nearby throughout, which was not the convention of the era but which Maria had requested, and which Edgar would not have abandoned regardless of convention. When the baby was placed in his arms for the first time, he held him with the same careful attention he gave everything precious, and looked at the small face with an expression that Maria, exhausted and happy, watched and stored away in the same way she had once stored a letter. They named him James Edgar Barker, for his grandfather first and his father second, which seemed to both of them the correct order. James Edgar was a serious baby who became a serious toddler, watching the world with his mother's dark, observant eyes and his father's economy of expression. He was also, when moved to it, the funniest person in any room, which was a quality neither of his parents had expected, and both of them found endlessly delightful. The commission operation grew steadily through the late 1880s. Maria's instinct for the market had been exactly right, and the territory's expanding cattle industry needed precisely what they offered. They hired 2 assistants by 1887, local men who learned the work quickly, and by 1888, the Alden Barker Cattle Commission was the most established independent brokerage in the southern Arizona Territory, with relationships from Tucson to the New Mexico border and a reputation for honesty that was, in the cattle business of that era, worth more than any other single attribute. Edgar rode the ranching country regularly, maintaining the relationships that were the foundation of the operation, and Maria managed the office and the accounts and the correspondence and the increasingly complex negotiations with the railroad and the larger buyers. It was a partnership in the fullest sense, a word that had meant something merely functional in her first marriage and now meant something entirely different, because a real partnership is built between people who see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. They had their second child in 1889, a girl this time, who came into the world with strong opinions about almost everything, and expressed them with a volume that the doctor described as impressive and Edgar described as formidable. They named her Clara Rose, for Maria's mother, and for the roses that grew along the south wall of what had been James Alden's house and was now, thoroughly and comfortably, the Barker family house. Clara Rose grew into a child of volcanic energy and extraordinary charm, the counterweight to her brother's thoughtful gravity. James, 5 years her senior, adored her with the solemn devotion of a firstborn who has been shown his greatest responsibility and taken it with complete seriousness. Watching them together was one of the specific joys of Edgar and Maria's daily life. In 1891, a situation arose that tested the strength of what they had built. A land speculator named Corbett had come into the Red Rock area with backing from Eastern investors and a plan to consolidate several of the smaller valley ranches under a single corporate operation, which was a pattern that was occurring across the Western territories as the frontier era gave way to more organized commercial enterprise. Corbett was not precisely dishonest, but he was aggressive, and he had resources that individual family ranchers could not match. And he had a particular interest in the Alden Barker operation, because controlling the primary brokerage in the region would give him significant leverage over the local cattle market. He approached Edgar first, at the commission office with an offer to buy the operation at a price that was, Edgar had to admit, reasonably fair on paper. Edgar thanked him and said he would need to discuss it with his wife, which Corbett treated as a formality, and Edgar did not correct him on. The discussion with Maria lasted 2 evenings and was one of the more important conversations of their marriage. She was not inclined to sell, which Edgar had expected. Her reasons were multiple and practical: the loss of independence, the disruption to their client ranchers who depended on a locally grounded operation, the broader effect on the regional ranching community of having the brokerage under corporate rather than independent control. She laid these out with the systematic intelligence that characterized her business thinking. Edgar agreed with all of it. He also said something additional. "If we sell," he said, "we become something other than what we are. We have built this specifically. The way it works is inseparable from who is running it." "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." They declined Corbett's offer. He was not pleased. He made a second approach, through an intermediary, with a higher number and some oblique language about the consequences of declining to participate in the regional consolidation. This was, Edgar recognized, a form of pressure, and he responded to it with the particular stillness of a man who has decided what he thinks and is not available to be moved. He wrote, with more fluency than he had possessed at 26, a letter to Corbett's Eastern backers, laying out the operational case for why an independent local brokerage produced better outcomes for the regional cattle economy than a corporately consolidated one. He included specific data from the Commission's 8 years of operation. He sent copies to 2 of the larger cattle buyers in Tucson with whom Maria had built relationships over the years. Maria read the letter before it went out and looked at him across the desk with an expression he particularly valued, the one that said she was genuinely impressed and was not going to entirely hide it. "You have become a formidable correspondent," she said. "I have had a good teacher," he said. "You have not had a teacher," she said. "You have simply decided to do it and done it." "That is how I have always done everything," he said. "I decide and then I do it." "Including riding 400 miles, she said. "Including riding 400 miles, he agreed. The letter had its intended effect. Corbett's Eastern backers were sufficiently persuaded of the independent operation's value that they withdrew pressure on the local consolidation. Corbett himself moved his attention to another region, and the Red Rock ranching community, which had been watching the situation with anxious attention, returned to normal operation with what felt like a collective exhale. The Caulfield family sent a letter of congratulation from Silver City, which they had heard about through the cattle network. Edgar read it at the breakfast table and felt a quiet satisfaction that was perhaps the best kind, the kind that is not about winning but about having been true to what matters. The 1890s brought change to the territory in large and small ways. The frontier era was genuinely ending, which was visible in the increasing number of settled families, the expansion of the school, the establishment of a second church, the arrival of a newspaper in Red Rock that provided local commentary in addition to the Tucson Wire reports. The cattle business continued, but its character shifted as the open range gave way incrementally to more organized grazing arrangements, and as the railroad networks became more sophisticated. Edgar and Maria Barker moved through this changing landscape with the adaptability of people who had built their lives on understanding what was actually in front of them rather than what they wished was in front of them. The commission operation evolved, adding services for smaller ranchers in navigating the more complex regulatory environment of the territorial period, which would become the early statehood era by the time Edgar was old enough to be thinking about his own future. James Edgar, at 14, was becoming someone who was going to be very interesting to know as an adult. He had inherited his mother's commercial intelligence and his father's practical competence, and he had developed an interest in law that Maria recognized, without irony, as possibly the most useful thing a man could bring to the cattle country of the 1890s. She encouraged it. Edgar, who had no particular feeling about law one way or another, supported it because he trusted Maria's judgment about people, including their son. Clara Rose, at 9, had decided she was going to be a teacher, a decision she had reached with the finality that characterized everything she decided, and which none of her family questioned because questioning Clara Rose's decisions was an exercise in futility that none of them were optimistic enough to attempt. She was also, by 9, the best reader in her school class, which her mother took as the highest possible compliment and her father took as unsurprising. One evening in the autumn of 1895, Maria found Edgar on the porch after supper, sitting in the chair he had always preferred, with the fading light over the desert and the first stars appearing in the darkening east. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat in the adjacent chair, and they were quiet together for a while in the particular comfortable silence of people who have been married for 12 years and have arrived at a place where silence between them is as eloquent as speech. "Edgar," she said eventually. He said. "Are you happy?" He turned his head to look at her in the fading light. It was a question she had never asked him in quite that direct form, and he considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said, comprehensively. She looked out at the desert. "I was thinking about the letter today," she said. "I am not sure why. I suppose I was looking at the cedar box while I was organizing the wardrobe, and I was thinking about what would have happened if I had answered it in 1877, she said, what that life would have looked like." "A different life," he said, "a very different one." "Better or worse, do you think?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think it would have been less fully itself. We were both different people in 1877. I was afraid of beginning things. You were a horse trader who had never written a letter. We needed to become the people who could build this before we could build it. That is a generous interpretation of 6 years of not answering a letter, he said, but gently because she knew he meant nothing by it. It is the accurate interpretation, she said. There is a difference. He recognized his own words from 12 years ago in her mouth and smiled. She saw the smile and returned it. I want to show you something, she said. She went inside and came back with the cedar box, which was wearing its age now in the way of well-used things, the wood softened and darkened by years of handling. She opened it. The lock of her mother's hair. The photograph, now quite faded. His letter, folded into its soft, familiar shape. She also took out a second piece of paper, folded once. She held it out to him. He unfolded it. It was in her handwriting, and it was the first draft of her letter to him from 1883, the one that had gone through 12 versions before the final. This was the first one, spare and unfinished, with crossed-out lines and marginal notes. He read it slowly. In the crossed-out lines and the unfinished sentences he could see every version of her courage that had not quite made it through, all the attempts to say the thing before she finally said it. You kept this, he said. I kept everything, she said. I am thorough. He folded it carefully and put it back in the box beside his own letter, and looked at the two of them lying there together. They belong together, he said. Yes, she said. They do. He picked up her hand, which was something he did without ceremony and with complete intention, and held it. The desert darkened around them, and the stars filled in overhead, and the roses on the south wall were dark shapes against the adobe. James Edgar, 20 years old in 1906, had indeed gone to study law, completing his education at the University of Arizona when that institution opened in Tucson, and he had returned to Red Rock to practice with a senior attorney, bringing to the work his mother's analytical intelligence and his father's steadiness, and a particular gift for navigating the increasingly complex water rights disputes that were becoming the primary legal terrain of the early 20th century Southwest. He was a serious young man who was, as Maria had known he would be, very interesting to know. Clara Rose, at 17, was teaching the younger children at the Red Rock School with a passionate competence that made the school board, most of whom had known her since childhood, feel simultaneously proud and somewhat relieved that they had a teacher this effective and slightly sympathetic toward the children who had to keep up with her expectations. Edgar at 55 was gray at the temples and in better physical condition than most men half his age, because he had never stopped the physical work that kept him connected to the land, still riding out to the ranches, still hauling feed, still doing with his hands the things he had always done with his hands. He had a reputation in the Red Rock area that had accumulated slowly over 20-plus years into something solid and specific, the kind of reputation that is built only by being consistently the same person across a very long time. Maria at 50 was what she had always been becoming, a woman of considerable force in the regional cattle and business community, respected with a specificity that went beyond the mere respect accorded to wives of prominent men. She had built the Edgar Barker operation into something that outlasted her father and was going to outlast, she hoped, at least the current generation. She still read everything she could acquire, which in the early 20th century was considerably more than it had been in the Abilene of her youth, and she still had the Roses, which were enormously established now, running the entire south side of the house and threatening to colonize the east wall if she gave them any additional encouragement, which she did. One Saturday in October of 1907, Edgar found her in the garden with the cedar box, which surprised him because she did not usually bring it outside. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reading," she said. He sat down beside her on the garden bench in the cool fall morning with the roses going to their autumn rest around them. She had the letter in her hands. "After 30 years," he said. "After 30 years it reads differently," she said. "The parts that were clumsy are the best parts now, the clumsy parts. Where you said you had never written a letter before and you hoped it did not show too much," she said. That line, I have read it 100 times and it never stops. He looked at the letter in her hands. Can I ask you something I have never asked? Yes. The very first time you read it, he said. In the hall in Abilene in 1877. What did you feel? She was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter with the expression of someone revisiting a room they know very well. Recognized, she said finally. I felt recognized, in a way I had not felt before, by someone I had only just met, which was the impossible part. How do you recognize someone in 4 days? You can't explain it, he said. No, she said. You can only carry it for 6 years until you work up the courage. He put his arm around her, which was comfortable in the way of things that have been done thousands of times and have never lost their value. She leaned into him, the letter in her hands, the garden around them, the desert morning vast and blue and indifferent overhead. Edgar, she said. Maria, he said. Thank you for writing it, she said. The one letter, the one impossible, impractical, never-before letter. Thank you for keeping it, he said. She folded it gently back into its shape. She put it in the cedar box. She closed the box and held it in her lap in the garden with her husband beside her and the roses around her and the life they had built together, extending in every direction as far as she could see. James Edgar Barker married in 1908. A woman named Helen Cross, who had come to Reed Rock from Tucson to visit her cousin, and had been retained in the territory by the sheer force of James Edgar's careful, concentrated attention, which was recognizable to his mother as something she had seen before and found entirely appropriate. Helen was 24 and James Edgar was 22, and the wedding was a proper church wedding with a reception at the Barker house where the roses, despite being late October, provided several final blooms as though they had specifically arranged it. Maria danced at her son's wedding with her husband, who had by now, after 24 years of practice, become genuinely good at the waltz, and she looked at him over his shoulder as they danced, and felt a contentment so complete that she did not try to articulate it even to herself. Clara Rose, to the considerable surprise of everyone except possibly herself, married in 1910, at 21, a schoolteacher named Patrick Lowe who had come to Reed Rock from New Mexico to take the senior teaching position at the expanded school. They were the most argumentative couple the town of Reed Rock had ever produced, because they were both Clara Rose and Patrick Lowe, and neither of them had ever developed a taste for being wrong. And they were also, as Maria observed to Edgar at their wedding, obviously and completely right for each other in the specific way that only very similar people, wrongly believing themselves to be different, can be. She is going to have an extremely interesting marriage, Edgar said. She is going to have the most interesting marriage in the territory, Maria agreed. The next years rounded out into something that was the quiet abundance of a life well lived and well shared. James Edgar's law practice grew, and he and Helen had a son in 1909 named Thomas James, for Maria's first husband first, because James Edgar had grown up knowing that history was not something to be erased but something to be acknowledged with grace, and because the name Thomas had been his grandfather's legal partner for years and deserved to go on. Thomas James was followed by a daughter in 1911, Emma, and then another son in 1913, William. Maria and Edgar were grandparents in a way that both of them found entirely unexpected in its intensity. The practical competence that Edgar brought to everything he did transferred without apparent effort to the management of grandchildren, who found him endlessly patient and specifically interesting, because he knew how things worked in the physical world and would explain it to them at length if asked. Maria read to them from everything and taught them, without explicitly teaching, how to watch a situation carefully before deciding what it meant. In 1915, Edgar and Maria made a decision that had been coming for some time, which was to step back from the day-to-day management of the commission operation and transition it formally to the next generation. James Edgar's legal expertise and business intelligence made him the natural successor, with the support of the two long-time employees who had been with the operation for over 20 years. The transition was planned and executed over a year, with the thoroughness that characterized everything the Alden-Barker partnership had ever done. On the day the papers were signed, Maria took the cedar box from the wardrobe where it had lived for 38 years and put it on the parlor table. Edgar came in from the porch and saw it there. "Marking the occasion," he said. "Something like that," she said. She opened it. The lock of hair, now almost 60 years old. The photograph, barely legible now but present. His letter, soft as cloth. Her first draft beside it where she had placed it 12 years ago. She also took out, from under the other items, a small bundle of notes, held together with a piece of ribbon. The notes he had sent her during the courtship period, the ones he had written while working at the Hollies Ranch, the precursors to the letter-writing ability he had not previously possessed. She had kept every one of them. "Edgar," she said, looking at the box. "Maria," he said, "I want to say something that I should have found a better way to say years ago." "All right. You rode 400 miles, she said, for a letter from a woman who had taken 6 years to answer. "That required more courage than I have given you enough credit for." He looked at her steadily. "It did not feel like courage," he said. "It felt like the only possible thing to do." "That is what courage is," she said. "When the only possible thing is also the hard thing." He sat down beside her at the parlor table, in the chair he had sat in on the first evening, 32 years ago, when she had looked at him across this same table with 6 years of a letter in her hands. He looked at her now, at 70 and 60 respectively, in the afternoon light of October 1915, and felt what he always felt in her presence, which was the complete rightness of having decided and acted and not looked back. "I would write it again," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the thing about you, Edgar. You would always write it again." She closed the cedar box. She kept it on the parlor table rather than putting it back in the wardrobe, because it seemed to her that the things in it had earned a place in the light. They kept the house on the north edge of Ridge Rock, which was a much larger and more established town by 1915 than it had been in 1878, but which still had the enormous sky and the red stone and the sage, and the roses along the south wall, which were 40 years old now, and had grown into something magnificent, deeply rooted and continuously blooming, returning every spring with the particular faithfulness of things that have found exactly the right conditions and do not intend to go anywhere. James Edgar brought his children to visit every Sunday, and the Barker house on those days was full in the way that houses are full when they contain multiple generations who are genuinely glad to be in the same room. Thomas James, at 6, had decided that his grandfather was the most interesting person he knew. Emma, at 4, had decided that her grandmother's garden was her personal domain. William, at 2, had not yet decided anything with coherence but was working on it. Clara, Rose, and Patrick came to Sunday dinners whenever the week allowed, arriving in argument about something specific and leaving in agreement about the same thing, which was their natural method. Patrick had become a genuinely good teacher, and Clara Rose had become, somehow, both more formidable and more tender as the years went on, which was the most Clara Rose thing about her. On a Sunday evening in November of 1915, when the children had all gone home and the house had settled back into its comfortable quiet, Maria sat on the porch with her husband in the chairs they had occupied for 30 years. The night was coming and the stars were starting and the desert was doing what the desert does at the end of a day, which is to release the light gradually and become something ancient and immense and entirely its own. "Edgar," she said. "Maria," he said. "If you had known in 1877 that it would take 6 years for an answer and then 32 more years to arrive here," she said, "would you still have written it?" He did not answer immediately. He sat with the question the way he sat with everything that mattered, with complete patience and honest consideration. The stars brightened as the sky darkened. The roses were a dark, fragrant presence along the wall. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "I said I would answer after thought," he said. The answer after thought is yes. She turned to look at him in the dark. Why? Because this is where the letter led, he said simply, and this is worth every year it took to get here. She reached over and took his hand, in the familiar, unhurried way of decades. He held it. They sat together on the porch of their house, in the desert dark of the Arizona Territory, in the year 1915, with 32 years of a real marriage behind them and all the stars above them and all the roots beneath them. And the letter that had started all of it, written once and kept for 6 years and answered at last, sitting in its cedar box on the parlor table inside, in the light.